Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today I have a special guest, the ever wonderful, esteemed Mr. Thomas, the master mafioso of Chicagoland, and the best revisionist historian I could ever bring on, and just an all around epic American. How are you doing today, Mr. Thomas?
Doing well. Thanks for hosting me.
Excellent. I'm happy to have you here because we have an interesting subject we're going to be discussing today.
Yeah, indeed. And like I said before we went live, I think probably 3 dedicated episodes on the topic would be appropriate to fully treat it in the capacity that it deserves. Rommel was an unusual officer in all kinds of ways. Even, there's an effort during the Eisenhower era to rehabilitate him in the historical record. And we've talked before about how I think especially specifically in the context of the Liebstandart boys, First SS, Piper himself, his death sentence was commuted, and ultimately his sentence was manumitted entirely. And this was a case of a lot of combat officers with storied records. During the era of the first Berlin crises, because it was clear that if the Bundesrepublik, if we were going to expect these people to fight, I mean, first of all, the kind of ongoing slander of the Wehrmacht had to be reined in, but also there was going to be a real need for experienced infantry commanders and armored commanders. But beyond all that, there was an effort to characterize certain personages, you know, um, as as good Germans who, in the American view, would be just kind of like apolitical officers who were fighting communism, because out of like love of fatherland and duty. And there's this movie. It's not like a terrible movie, but it doesn't. It's called The Desert Fox. It's got James Mason who plays Rommel, and it's got like really interesting set pieces. And Mason goes around this like leather greatcoat, which is pretty cool. But I mean, he just doesn't seem like Rommel. And the film treatments for Rommel that are paint him as yeah, it's kind of it's kind of like they either cast him as kind of almost like a MacArthur type figure, but who happens to be a Kraut, or they um or they cast him as kind of this like Prussian martinet, but like who also delivers. His arrogance isn't just founded upon honorific title, but that's not accurate either. Like Rommel was a Swabian, and like very much one. When he returned from the Great War at age 27, like very battle hardened and a national hero. He held the Blue Max, and we'll get into the story behind that. And his bride and his close confidants made the point that he'd come to talk like a Prussian parade ground officer, but like if you got him alone with his intimates, his Swabian accent would emerge. But he was not a conventional officer in any sense, and nor was he some sort of like von Stauffenberg type traitor in waiting or something. The execution of Rommel was a gross injustice. I mean, it's a horrible story. You know, and Manfred Rommel, who passed away some years back, did a lot to honor his father's memory, and it was you could see the pain in his face when he talked about his father's last day. But the Rommel being unceremoniously forced to commit suicide by the SD and Gestapo in the wake of the July 20 plot that had nothing to do with Rommel's actual sentiment. Okay, he'd never been directly approached by the conspirators. I don't think I'm speculating at all. If he had been, I don't think he would have sold them out to the SD, but I think he would have said, I don't want any part of this. He certainly would not have wanted anything to do with leading some military junta in the wake of the Fuhrer's murder. I mean, the the whole thing is insane. There were a lot of jealousies around Rommel the man, and Rommel didn't do himself any favors. He antagonized people, but it's also the he was deliberately sold out by his adjutant, in my opinion. We're getting ahead of ourselves. We'll get into that in the final episode. But what I kind of wanted to commence this with was, to convey an understanding that, the preconceptions people have about Rommel generally are totally wrong. And we'll get into some of these biographical facts here in a minute. But first, let's present some context. The what became the Wehrmacht, and really what was underway in the Kaiser's army. And World War I was a very strange battlefield situation for all combatants, particularly on the Western Front, because battle lines were confined to the point where area denial took on an outsized significance. There was circumstances, geographic and technological, conspired to create stalemates and things. And obviously that experience caused the remnants, the general staff, to make a dedicated study of why this and how this happened, so that it could be avoided in the future. But even as the Great War was underway, it began as armies were fielded in 1914. There was still dominant thinking, that really originated in like set piece battles of the final Napoleonic Wars. Okay, by the time World War I ended, it can be said confidently and not euphemistically that the German army and the American army were two modern mechanized forces, like facing off against each other. Okay, that kind of rapid and punctuated development in the course of one continuing conflict, I believe, is unprecedented. The man who really had the most impact in developing what became the doctrines that people like Rommel, von Manstein, Rundstedt, von Thoma, who I'm a great admirer of, as I got into in the Spanish War series with Pete Quinones. Kind of the progenitor of these theoretical postulates was Hans von Seeckt. War college types in this country, they'll go as far as to say that the Wehrmacht that took the field in 1939 was essentially von Seeckt's creation. I won't go that far because it's reductionist, but that's the way military academics think. But von Seeckt was he was very much the product of the Prussian General Staff system, which had existed in some form, official or unofficial, since 1806. And to understand, every modern army now that has any meaningful combat capability or that maintains forces in being at any scale that can be said to be operationally viable emulates in some way the Prussian, later the German General Staff system. Okay, the way we do it is overburdened, in my opinion, with an emphasis on engineering and logistics and classroom learning, as well as kind of corporate sociology, quite literally. I mean, that can be argued either way. I'm not a general, so I could you could say that's not even my place to weigh in on that. But regardless of the emphasis and regardless of the kind of the core orientation of the curriculum, there is some iteration of of a staff system in every modern army today. Again, that has a combat capability to deploy at scale. Now, essentially, what the Prussian staff system did, it was kind of parodied and maligned by London and Paris as like, oh, this is just these kinds of aristocrats and warmongers, sitting around, like some kind of fraternity or something. That's not what it was at all. These guys were actively gaming scenarios constantly, and this was the real study of war. Okay, this was not just glad handing for promotions. Like by the time you got to the general staff, like you already had it in the bag. Okay, you didn't. Your ambition such that it existed, and yes, the Prussian officer of myth and lore was definitely jealous of ambition and recognition and clout, but you captured that when war arrived. Like the idea that the Prussian general staff like functioned, like the U.S. Army War College or the Pentagon today, where it's men desperately admiring their own like files, like or in the perfection of their personnel file, like like some girl admiring a prom dress. Like that didn't go on. Okay, and it's remarkable in the absence of modern data aggregation means that they could effectively game the scenarios they did to the degree they did, and like in the kind of depth and complexity that they did. Von Seekt himself, immediately after World War One, he convened 57 different studies, replete with their own committee to study World War One. Basically every iteration of it, but with a specific emphasis on combined arms. Like what's necessary to sustain combined arms. What do we do wrong? How can we proceed at scale, against our probable enemies in the future, absorb the attrition that we have to, while still sustaining the capability to apply firepower in a way that, is going to be able to devastate him to such a degree that he can't reconstitute. Okay. And the result of all this was, in my opinion, the most significant book on warfare, quad warfare, and military science since Clausewitz. It was called Leadership in Battle with Combined Arms. It was published in 1923. Okay, and this became something of the Bible for most Wehrmacht general officers. Okay, that's indisputable. And the stamp of von Seekt, it was probably most felt in the Waffen SS and the Luftwaffe, interestingly enough. Von Seekt, his ideal force structure, it didn't just entail highly mobile operations, centered around the advance of fire, which is always the German sensibility. But it emphasized crucial points of attack, rather than just maximizing the body count and concerning oneself with, geographic objectives. And obviously, all this entailed a significant role for air power, but tactical air power. That's essential. People make the point about men like Jaschanik and even like Ernst Udet, who's a lot more sympathetic than Jaschanik, both of whom unceremoniously committed suicide, as people know who studied the subject. But and there's a lot to criticize with both men and what became the state of the Luftwaffe by 1942. But and that's well placed. But what one can't lay at their feet is this claim that, well, the Luftwaffe was doomed. They didn't have a strategic bombing capability that wasn't really within the contemplation of the kind of new school of warfare articulated by von Seect. It was battlefield oriented. It didn't envision total war as it developed as either a path to victory or as a desirable capability to cultivate. The idea was, to knock out your enemy before he even has a chance to mobilize. Okay, which axiomatically includes a tendency to strike first always. Okay, and that's one of the things that underlies the lie of German militarism. The way Prussia / Germany, and I talk about them as a single actor and entity for purposes of what we're discussing. I'm not saying Germany's not a diverse place. I'm not saying that Prussia is all that matters. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm saying for our purposes, topically, they can be discussed as being synonymous. Okay, I want to make that clear. But the way Prussia, Germany, the only way it could win wars is by striking first. You do not wait to be attacked. That's fatal. America can afford to do that. The Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, can afford to do that, even if attrition is terrible in the latter's case. Prussia could not afford to do that. That doesn't indicate some abject tendency to provoke wars or whatever the reasoning is of, court historians. It's like saying that the man who moves first in a game of chess is the aggressor. Like, it doesn't make any sense in ethical terms, and unless we're talking about truly evil ambitions in the course of war. Like, we can't talk about war qua war itself in terms of aggressors and defenders. At some point in any conflict, every party is both aggressor and a defender. But one of the ways von Seeckt's stamp ended up on what became the Wehrmacht is that post demobilization, it was very hard to remain in the German army, what became the Reichswehr after the Great War. Only the truly best and the brightest really were retained. Von Seeckt had tried to demand a 200,000 man force at Versailles. Obviously, all that was afforded was half that. And the reasoning was twofold on the German side. Even among there was an inherent authority that accrued to military officers. The internal situation required officers of a certain caliber and character to retain any semblance of order at all, particularly amidst the enduring starvation blockade and the effects of that, and the radicalization of huge swaths of the population, and the revolutionary tendencies of a no longer nascent but highly developed communist movement. It wasn't just people like von Seeckt looking to, okay, we got to retain the best men because we've got to make do with a truly gutted skeleton force for our army. It was also, we need men who can hold the nation together and who can basically act in like almost a constabulary capacity. Okay. But also what von Seeckt was doing was he realized at some point the status quo as it was imposed by Versailles would come to an end, either by the pen or by the sword, or even just by the passage of time and a softening of the Allies' most punitive sentiments towards Germany. There had to be some kind of core in place of officers with extensive battle experience, who could rebuild. Seeked especially favored Reichswehr officers who had experience in air combat. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why the Luftwaffe was so good. Um, a lot of that owes to a lot of that owes to Erhard Milch. A lot of those to Goering himself. I mean, Goering was a flawed person. He was kind of easy to lampoon, but he was a war hero. He was a great pilot, and when he wasn't, you know, indulging in his kind of most debased vices, he was a great man. And I think the way he acquitted himself in his final act at Nuremberg, I think proves that, regardless of anything else.
Yeah, I
But
think people tend to forget just the pure chaos of what happened after post World War One, and sort of this peace imposed on them by Paris. Like, I mean, you had the collapse of three massive empires across Europe, which kept peoples under control for hundreds of years, and then you also had the emergence of this radical ideology called communism in the form of the nascent kind of Russian Revolution, which people forget at this time. His goal was to spread and conquer Germany at the same time. And you had a massive, like, communist
well,
kind of
yeah, and I
third
mean
bloc in Bavaria.
Trotsky was leading armies against Poland. I mean, that's actually catapulted the Polish military junta into power. Was that they fended off? I mean, to their credit, they fended off the Red Army, which was on a Jacobin crusade. And yeah, there were the communists were actually capturing ground in Germany proper. This wasn't a theoretical postulate or a potential danger. It was
They declared their own republic for a little
yeah,
bit.
exactly. But it von Seect, interestingly, he spent the majority of the Great War in the East, particularly on the Ottoman, like on the front, on in Asia Minor and the Ottoman front. Um, and as a sign, like people, you find military historians like more proximate to World War One as well as now, who say that, like, oh well, von Seect, the general staff should have deployed him to the west because he had this great aptitude for combined arms, which in the Great War was artillery, obviously. Um, and he had this great ability to instinctively kind of read battlefield conditions, identify the correct course of action, rapidly devise an operational program and then implement it. The idea is like, well, everything would have changed, at like places like the Somme and like the Argonne, and I mean, like, von Seect's been there. They're kind of missing the point. On the Eastern Front, on the Russian front, as well as in Turkey, um, the characteristics that tended towards stalemate were absent. It was a highly mobile battle space. Okay, it could be utilized as a laboratory for tactical innovation in a way that um, forces deployed in the West it would not be feasible for them to so proceed. Okay. And also beyond that, like Irving made the point, look, if von Seect had been deployed in the West, he probably would have suffered a lot of the same criticisms as people like Ludendorff, like rightly or wrongly, and been said like, hey, look, like this was a disaster, and it's because of people like von Seect who put so much stock in the 1918 offensive and didn't account for the capabilities of the AEF and everything else. I mean, that's academic. That's an academic claim or argument, but I think it's basically irrebuttable.
Yeah, people also tend to forget that World War One wasn't just like France and Belgium. Like, people forget about like the fact that there was a front going on in the Caucasus and Mesopotamia against
There's
the
an
Ottomans
African
and the
front.
British. Yeah, there was one in
Piper's Piper's father fought in Africa, which I think is fascinating. there weren't a lot of men deployed there, but their contribution was substantial, and it certainly had it had lasting political ramifications in all kinds of ways. And it also, you know, it provided essential data about, you know, deployment, you know, like far abroad, you know, in sub-Saharan Africa, which prior to that, you know, the idea was, and at that time, you know, the Kaiserreich was in the traditional kind of, you know, game of colonies. You know, there was a belief that, even among even among these kind of Germanophobic London types who were prone to cast the Germans as being this kind of like invincible evil. There was this tendency of them to claim like, oh, you know, the Germans can't defend objectives in Africa. That's going to be like shooting fish in a barrel, you know, like when it comes to war in the colonies, at least. I mean, and that was not true at all. Um, so that's important. Yeah, and yeah, the diversity of combat scenarios in the Great War is something that it's something that shouldn't be ignored. It should be very much accounted. I mean, it happens. I mean, that happens in like in every conflict. People come to identify conflicts with like a certain with a certain paradigm. You know, like and and I mean, part of that was like the movies and stuff, but it's also, you know, people are always looking for some like critical battle or some critical personage to understand warfare in totality, and that's always kind of misguided. So they always kind of have like they've got this kind of like um telescopic view of it. But in any event, distilled down, von Sieg's idea in the interwar years and what has become like just modern military doctrine. You know, the idea was that the goal of any future army should be to eliminate opposing forces before they mobilize completely. Okay, this would obviously best be achieved with a highly mobile, highly trained men, and combined arms. Um, and this was one of the inability of the Kaiserreich to knock out the Russian Empire essentially immediately. This is really what cost victory in the Great War. Okay, I firmly believe that. That was obviously what von Sieg was getting at. Towards that end, you know, obviously to maintain a force capable of such things, that's extraordinarily costly. It's not costly in the same way as maintaining, you know, massive forces at scale, but it's costly in other ways and in some ways more difficult to maintain. But, you know, to kind of remedy those outlays, von Sieg said, like, look, like we don't need a defensive army. He's like, all we need is the ability to fend off a surprise attack, you know, and obviously good intelligence is essential too, and that's, you know, part of the core of any military organization that succeeds. But you know, this was very the kind of siege sensibility which Adolf Hitler could never totally let go of, and honestly, neither can America. You know, like I was reading a lot, into some stuff my dad and I were discussing, but also just some of my own research relating to, you know, something I'm working on. The the U.S. Army War College is a pretty recent innovation, and there's some interesting stuff that came out of there during the Cold War. I mean, there's some profoundly interesting stuff, but this idea, this kind of obsession with you know, defensive kind of siege capabilities, you know, and kind of muscle bound force structures, like there's something like instinctive in people to equate, you know, that with defense, when in reality, you know, your ability to kill the enemy is really what I mean. The best defense is a good offense. Okay, I mean, let's speak Lombardi. That's not just like it's not just like some cliche or something or something people say, but it's difficult, particularly when you're talking. I mean, obviously, there's not room for error in war and peace questions. And you can't you're talking about literally life and death conditions. It's hard for people to overcome this idea of I literally need to guard my flanks and I literally need to fortify and like dig in, and then I need to think about attacking. Like that's what cost Germany the war, I believe. Well, that's outside the scope for discussion, but it's like a natural. It's literally like a human tendency to be averse to the disposition von Siegt was describing as essential. It and that's so. In other words, the strength of the strength of the new German army, as von Siegt was contemplating in 1923, would be entirely in its mobility. You know, a large contingent of cavalry or whatever succeeded cavalry. You know, incredibly well conditioned infantry that drilled all the time, so that like a forced march would not sap morale or or fighting ability. A full complement of motorized and mechanized units. You light machine guns deployed throughout, and mobile artillery. Like the advance of fire is being absolutely essential. And the ability to apply direct and indirect fire, rapidly and continuously, is obviously the linchpin. Okay. I know it was a long introduction, but it had to, I think von Siegt, other than the like West Point type guys I talked to, or guys who served in the infantry, and who bone up quite literally on military science and things. Von Sieg is not a man that people really study. Even people who are into 20th century stuff. So that's part of why I felt that was essential. But it's also essential in understanding the uh, the kind of sociological and professional environment that made Erwin Rommel. Like I said a minute ago, Rommel wasn't a natural soldier, and he wasn't some Prussian martinet. He uh, he was born in Württemberg, which is east of the Rhine. It's proximate to the French border. Now, I believe, and if any of our German friends are on deck, Baden-Württemberg, I believe, actually borders France. Um, in those days, it didn't. Um, because the borders were differently drawn, obviously. But he was a Swabian. His mother was the daughter of a local politician of some esteem or prestige. His dad was a schoolmaster. Erwin Rommel Sr. was a teacher. He was the headmaster of the local secondary school. He had a reputation of being a strict kind of pedant. Rommel's Rommel's brothers recalled in later years. Erwin Rommel's father died in 1913, so I mean he died um, when Rommel was a young man, but he was described as a harsh and overbearing guy. Um, he apparently constantly drilled his sons in esoteric knowledge, of history, of biology, of all manner of subjects. He was kind of like a consummate taskmaster, but he and the sons diverged in their careers. The Rommel boys. It Rommel's brother Carl. He became an army aviator who, in peacetime, he captured a bunch of photographs of the Great Pyramids and the Suez Canal, which became like iconic. And when aerial photography was in its infancy, he was something of a pioneer in this regard. Gerhard, who was the youngest Rommel boy, became an opera singer, kind of like a starving artist type. Rommel had a sister, Helen, who shunned, kind of the spotlight and didn't have any interest in consulting with historians or talking about her family, which is understandable. But my point is, like, Rommel didn't come from a military family. His brother joined the service. That's what a lot of German youth did. But interestingly, it seems Karl Rommel's primary passion was for flight. And obviously in those days there wasn't a civilian path to that. So, and Rommel himself, he was a little guy. He was short. He was sickly throughout his youth. He was, unwell a lot of the time. But what he did have, he had a tremendous mechanical bent. As a 14-year-old, famously, he and a friend built a full-scale box glider in a field by Rommel's house. And apparently it could fly for several yards, which is remarkable. Okay. There's pictures of it in the Rommel family papers, and in the first edition of David Irving's The Trail of the Fox, which is a great book, there's snapshots of it. So Rommel had he had that kind of characteristic German knack for imagination and engineering, and obviously, that was coveted by the military. And the German army of the Kaiserreich was a lot more meritocratic in the way we look at it than people think. It was not at all as upward mobility for a common man. Obviously, was nothing like it wasn't the Third Reich where that was actively cultivated, but you were definitely officer material if you were middle class and you had skills that lent themselves to battlefield command. And ironically, or maybe not so much, Rommel's dad, who again seems to have not been particularly missed by the family when he died, and who was remembered by Rommel's siblings as being something of a petty tyrant, he was largely responsible for getting Rommel into the military. In a letter, Erwin Rommel Sr., who had some clout as a headmaster of a secondary school, he wrote to the Württemberg army post, this kind of glowing recommendation of his son, saying that he'd done really well in gymnasium, that he had this kind of like knack for engineering, that he was constantly loyal and patriotic, and it's kind of like in need of some outlet for these energies. And both the artillery and the engineers rejected Rommel's application, but the infantry grabbed him up. In March 1910, the 124th Württemberg Infantry ordered him to report for medical evaluation and processing. And despite his kind of sickly constitution, other than a hernia, he was found to have no health problems that would have precluded him. Rommel's father arranged for the operation. Again, kind of whatever else can be said of the man, he obviously loved his son and recognized in him what the boy's career path should be. Signed the papers for his enlistment, helped him buy his uniform as an officer cadet, and on July 19th, only days after leaving the hospital, Erwin Rommel joined the regiment, and he was posted soon afterwards to Danzig. at the Royal Officer Cadet School. November the following year, now 1911, Rommel completed cadet school, and the commandant wrote an evaluation which viewed him as in in drill work and things like fencing, gymnastics, and things. He said he was adequate, but being of thin and rather awkward and delicate physically, he didn't excel at these kinds of tests of physicality. But he did say that he had immense willpower and he was firm in character with a keen enthusiasm. And he said he was conscientious and he said comradely to the point that he was definitely officer material. Like, in other words, the intangibles at that point, at that tender age, is what these cadet school officer types like saw in him. It was around this time Rommel met the lady who would become his wife. In those days, I think all across Europe, but especially in Germany, it was tradition. The cadets were obliged to attend these formal balls that were held in the officers' mess. And the daughters of good Danzig citizens, would like present themselves, and dance with these, officers, which is great stuff. That's kind of stuff that should happen. But Rommel met Lucy Mullen, who was a dancer, and she was Italian and Polish. She was not German, interestingly. She was a very stern woman. People described her, including Irving, as like handsome. Like, that doesn't mean she was like butch looking or something, but she wasn't conventionally beautiful or anything. But she was definitely classy, and like it kind of, the photos of them together, like young Rommel and young Lucy. Rommel was kind of like a shy person. I mean, the guy was an absolute stud on the battlefield, as we'll see, but he was awkward around people. It just kind of like makes sense that he'd connect with this kind of woman. Like, she was neither a sex bomb nor a kind of typical officer's wife. And like I said, it's interesting. I find her background interesting. Just that pairing. I mean, that's a fine heritage, Italian and Polish. I'm not saying that's weird or something. Quite the contrary. But it you'd think of a man like Rommel as having a consummately kind of German wife. But that's another way in which he was kind of against the grain, I guess. It was January 12th, the subsequent year, now 1912, Rommel received his officer commission. He was posted to the 124th Infantry of the Württemberg Army, which had initially accepted him. And the 124th, they were garrisoned in an actual disused monastery near Stuttgart, which I find fascinating. And that's that's where they drilled, that's where they slept, that's where they took mess. He got noticed at that time. He didn't propose to Lucy until he was on leave in 1916. So, this courting process went on for years, but he was totally committed to her, apparently, from the time he met her. And her mother disapproved of him, like mother-in-laws do. So he'd secretly write her letters and sneak out to see her. But point being, like, he didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he wasn't chasing skirt. So he was serious in a way that most of his comrades weren't, when they had leave time. And he basically would spend his weekends writing letters to Lucy or just literally studying military theory. Interestingly, by March of 1914, he was transferred to the 49th Field Artillery at Ulm, not far from where he grew up. As we mentioned a moment ago, combined arms of the Great War era was artillery, and there's a complexity to directing artillery, just on its own terms, but particularly in concert with infantry and cavalry. Stonewall Jackson, he cut his combat teeth in the Mexican War, like most of the Corps, the Confederate General Officer Corps, but he had a masterful grasp of artillery. Okay, it makes sense that Rommel, like once kind of his remarkable intellect kind of became clear to his superiors, and after he'd proven himself a couple years into his commission, that the artillery branch would snap him up. Okay, and obviously commanding an artillery battery initially at onset of hostilities in the Great War served him extraordinarily well with coming to become comfortable with armor and fighting in armor, which is not something a lot of men can do. It's incredibly complicated, and especially then when your resources to calculate things is literally a pen and a paper and your imagination. I mean, I emphasize that point a lot, and I'm sure that makes me sound like an old person, but it really can't be overstated, like how the advantages people have today in all kinds of endeavors, but particularly a combat command. Okay, like literally having a you know having the kind of data awareness that you do and the ability to calculate rapidly is, I mean, it's like night and day. But it his uh his first as as World War One got underway, again his first he spent the first 2 years on the Western Front in France, in intense combat. But his first posting, as I just stated, was the 49th Artillery. He himself stated in his diary just a few months into the war, he said, quote, "For me, this is the last exercise with the artillery, as things are now growing very serious indeed. I must get back to my own parent regiment, the 124th Infantry, at all costs. I must get back to the riflemen." This wasn't just because he'd spent, his first 2 years, drilling recruits as an infantry officer, but the infantry remains the core, like the axis around which combined arms orbit, and I mean that it wasn't just romantic attachment, to the rifleman's role in combat. It was like the brass tacks of the ground element will always be the infantry. That might go without saying to some people, but I think it's an important thing that needs to be emphasized. In January 1915, Rommel got his way. He returned to the 124th Infantry after being wounded in September, that preceding September. He took a ricocheting bullet in his left thigh. And owing to heroism in that same engagement, he was awarded the Iron Cross second class. Once he was transferred back to the infantry branch, he and the 124th were immediately thrown into the Argonne, which was nightmarish, just absolutely grueling trench warfare. 2 weeks after his arrival, he crawled with his platoon through 100 yards of barbed wire into the heart of the main French positions. He captured 4 bunkers, held them off against a counterattack by a French battalion, then withdrew to reconstitute, so a new attack could be mustered. And he lost less than a dozen. He lost less than a dozen men. This won him the Iron Cross First Class, and that was the first for a junior officer in the entire regiment. Okay, and this is mission oriented tactics in the textbook sense, and especially when you consider, I mean, Rommel had been in combat for months with an artillery battery. That's different than being a rifleman at the Argonne. Okay, but he took to this immediately. And he had no fear. Apparently, I mean, you can't if you lead from the front in those under those conditions, and the ability to seize initiative in the absence of orders. I mean, that's the backbone of the German army. Okay, it always has been, and it always will be. And I emphasize these points a lot because one of the more foolish canards, people say that, oh, the Germans lost World War II because their junior officers and NCOs can't think for themselves. Like that's literally retarded. It's like literally the opposite of reality. But Rommel, he pulled off these kinds of little tactical coups again and again. Several months later, he was injured again by shrapnel. He was hoping to be sent to the Turkish theater, which is fascinating to me. Like he went so far as to begin learning Turkish when he was convalescing, and it begs the question as to why. But as we mentioned in the introduction, Hans von Seeckt, viewing the Turkish front as a veritable kind of laboratory of war, I guarantee that was also on Rommel's mind. It was not easy duty. I mean, it might not have been as hellish as the Argonne, but it's not. It was miserable for other reasons and just as dangerous. I mean, there's no safe spot in the infantry, so there's not
There's no
some
safe spaces, that's for
no.
sure.
So there's not any self-interested reason anyone can confabulate as to why Rommel would want to be fighting in Asia in lieu of France. But what did happen was that October he was posted as a company commander to the new Württemberg Mountain Battalion, which is we were talking about before we went live. I mean, this was special operations in some nascent proto sense. Okay, in all but name. The Württemberg Mountain Battalion trained for a full year. The battalion consisted of 6 rifle companies, 6 light machine gun platoons, and they were transferred to Romania in 1916. Romania had a very strange political situation in the Great War, owing to who was at the helm at any given time. By 1916, the Germans were fighting against the Russians there, and the Romanians were nominally fighting on the side of the Entente, but they were fighting on Romanian soil. Okay, and they were essentially at odds with everybody, but nominally they were fighting against the Central Powers. And Rommel made the point that the Romanians in Romania were very game fighters and very tough, and this was a very dangerous situation. Okay, Theodor Werner was one of the platoon leaders who served under Rommel, and he made the point that Rommel, when he first saw him, I guess in late 1915, he said he was slightly built, almost schoolboyish, and people were like, "Who the hell is this guy?" But by that point he'd been wounded repeatedly. He held the Iron Cross, and Werner said that the fighting spirit somehow of this guy permeated the whole regiment. Like he the guy had to say he had initiative doesn't even begin to describe it. You know, like he'd think of these kinds of just like spectacular acts of gallantry that nobody would actually follow through with and just do it. You know, like crawling 100 yards under barbed wire to assault, um, you know, a French bunker position, and then you know kill everybody, withdraw before they can reinforce, you know, and like reconstitute another assault force and like jump right back into the fray. I mean, like there's like stuff of the movies or of you know some cheap novel or something. But again, that reflects what the commandant said in his evaluation of Officer Cadet Rommel, that you know he's an unremarkable man in any physical sense, but this completely outsized, like was holy crusader zeal, you know, is what sets him apart. And I mean that's really what makes warriors, you know, and that's what makes officers especially. I mean, at base, an officer's job is to lead, and what is leadership? Leadership is what to lead is to motivate. You know, I mean, this is again, that might sound like corny stuff you find in some community college, you know, MBA curriculum or something, but like it's it's not it is a truism, okay, that can't be denied. um by 1917, Ron was designated an Abteilung. These were ad hoc detachments. They varied in strength from between 3 to 7 mountain companies, and mountain companies were smaller than traditional infantry companies. But again, what Rommel was doing in Romania and pretty much throughout the Eastern Front, wherever he found himself posted, this was mission oriented tactics, which you know goes back to the 30 Years' War and German armies, but it was what we would consider to be special operations, you know, or what was the progenitor of that, you know, and August 10th, Rommel was wounded yet again. Um, a small arms round from the rear passed through his left arm. Despite the injury, Rommel continued to fight for 2 weeks before convalescing. He finally did convalesce and reported to the hospital. It was late September. The battalion was transferred to northern Italy, which was an incredibly demanding theater, and this was true mountain combat. Um, the battlefield there was as different as can be imagined from France. Um, it was literally fighting on trails amidst towering mountains, you know, like abutted by ravines, like hundreds of feet down, you know, rushing rivers. Yeah, like mountain fighting. You know, it's and General von Bello was the commander in theater. Artillery was incredibly dangerous to infantry here because it would cause avalanches. Um, and when it didn't, just when it hit the face of the rocks, it would fill the air with like sharpened splinters that would you know cut people's flesh to pieces. There was heavy rain, um, which compromised visibility almost completely. Um, it had swollen the streams into raging torrential rivers that people would literally, in attempting to cross, would get swept up into them and drown. Um, a number a number of officers and enlisted men, as well as pack animals, which are still essential for mountain fighting. Because I mean, you can't drive armored vehicles or personnel carriers or you know or
Supply
you know
trucks up a
yeah
mountain.
nothing's coming up a literal mountain. You know it. And interestingly, it was in this theater where I mean, Rommel wasn't the glory hound in the sense. I mean, he could bag it up. Okay, I mean, like he loved clout, like to explain the mystique around it. But what von Bello he declared that the first battalion or company commander who reached the highest peak in theater would be awarded the Pearl of Merit. And Ferdinand Schorner, who was a lieutenant and was the last or the second to last Feldmarschall commissioned by Adolf Hitler, and just a great officer, like a ruthless officer, who I think is grossly underrated. You know, he was a young lieutenant, as Rommel was, and as Rommel was commanding forces, kind of almost in this race, to I mean, like a literal race to, like, you know, capture this objective, prestige objective or not. You know, taking the high ground was essential to neutralizing the Italians' ability to mount offensive operations. Ferdinand Schorner reported that the pace was so horrific, and they were so exhausted by fighting that and manhandling these heavy loads of machine guns and ammunition. At least one of his men dropped dead from exhaustion before they reached the objective, which the broader objective was Colivret Ridge. Schorner was given honors for taking Hill 1114. This outraged Rommel was convinced that the credit was due him. And to add insult to injury, subsequently, as I just said, that Von Bello had specifically promised the officer to stand atop the highest point in theater would also receive the Blue Max. That point was Mount Matier. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation. It was a 5,400-foot peak. After the Hill 1114 engagement was resolved, any prisoners were dealt with. Rommel set his sights on Mount Mature, regiment of Salerno Brigade, which was a very game Italian force, put up savage resistance. But by nightfall, after a full day of hard fighting, Rommel and his men were at the base of the final rise of Mature. But they drove on and captured the peak. 11:30 a.m. of the next day, the last 100 or so defenders on the actual summit surrendered personally to Rommel. And 10 minutes later, apparently Rommel himself stood there, you know, as the conquering hero, and he ordered 1 white and 3 green flares fired to announce his triumph. You know, so like victory was his. But the very next day, Ludendorff, who was chief of the general staff, he announced the capture of Mount Mature. But he announced that the man who captured it was Lieutenant Walter Schnieber, a Silesian company commander who was somewhere in theater. It's not clear if Schnieber thought that he had captured Mount Mature or some other peak, or if he was just lying. But like Rommel became convinced that there was a conspiracy to deprive him of the Blue Max. He sent a formal complaint all the way to the commander of the Alpine Corps, that the medal by rights belonged to him, which is pretty ballsy in the in the German army. Like, frankly, you know, it. But finally, at long last, the Battle of Longarone, Rommel had only 25 men at his disposal. And when the Italian officers commanding the opposing force, when they saw how puny Rommel's force was, they assaulted immediately. Um, Rommel himself was able to slip into the shadows. His 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 Abteilung took heavy casualties. I think about 50% attrition. They were able to reconstitute. Rommel and his men, to prevent the enemy from outflanking them, they set fire to the houses along the road, illuminating the battlefield. By midnight, reinforcements from the Habsburg Austrian army arrived. Rommel renewed the assault at dawn, which the Italians were convinced that the Germans had been routed, and they at best they were like a skeleton force, 20 or 50 men. But Rommel assaulted, fully reinforced by the Austrians, cut the Italians to pieces. The took hundreds of Italians prisoner, virtually an entire division. Okay, and when news of this reached Ludendorff, the general staff, and the newspapers, the Kaiser, personally issued the order for Rommel to get his pour le mérite. And if you look at photos up until Rommel's death, he wasn't like an award hound like Goering or anything, but he always wore the blue max. I mean, it's a beautiful award, but it obviously that was his finest hour. In a career full of absolutely outsized accomplishments that would be considered superhuman, by if said to be the deeds of a lesser man. But Rommel had a funny relationship with the Italians. I mean, in the Africa Corps years, and before and subsequent, and apparently it was like a point of pride where he'd always make the point that it was at Longarone that he won the Blue Max, and I guess that was something of a sore point with some of the Italians under his command later.
Yeah, he famously had a great relationship with his Italian boss, Mr. What was his name? He called him Bastico, but it was like
yeah, I can't remember, but it's like Swabians are also just wise ass people, and I mean, I think there was no, I think the Italians who fought under Rommel, they loved him like everybody else did. I mean, he was a taskmaster in a way that some people, I mean, German or Italian, weren't used to. I mean, but it's also the Italians in fighting in Africa. I mean, these were battle hardened guys. Italy was cursed somewhat with less than stellar officers, but I made the point to people too. The Italians who volunteered to fight on the Ostfront, they were very game, man. They're somewhat unduly maligned. In the later years, especially after Salerno, there's some less than proud moments of the Italian army, but you can't compare the guys with the Africa Corps or who volunteered, to fight in the Soviet Union. You can't compare them to half-ass conscripts, who may, who under ordinary circumstances probably wouldn't have even found themselves in service. But that's we'll get into all that when we reconvene. Like I said, I think 3 episodes, and we can go for more if you want. But I think another episode in maybe a week or so about the Africa Corps and Rommel's exploits in North Africa, and particularly That's it was and the pitched battles against the British, but also Operation Torch. And it's a fast 1943 Kasserine Pass. Um, it was Rommel's forces that first engaged the U.S. Army, and they cut them to pieces. That's one of the reasons why Patton was given that command. Um, but we'll get into all that, and then finally, like I said, we should get into in the final episode Rommel's relationship, such that there even was one, to the July 20 plot. And his ultimate demise and misconceptions therein, and his his contribution to the Atlantic Wall, and the creation of the defenses therein, as well as his kind of final Rommel was insistent that the armored reserves had to deploy on the beaches, because if the Allies were able to establish a beachhead, it was over. Um, and that's a fascinating story. Yeah, we might go 4 episodes. I mean, it's totally up to you. It's your show, but a dedicated Normandy episode, like the Atlantic Wall, Overlord, and then the final, there were some bizarre intrigues too with Rommel's staff. Um, some people think they've been compromised by OSS. Um, I mean, it's a very fascinating sort of a subtopic within the story of Rommel. But I
Yeah, he had
hope,
a fascinating relationship with Franz Halder, the chief of the
yeah,
OKH, who
Helder was a
famously
real
hated him.
he was a real snake, and interestingly, he became like the man in the nascent Bundeswehr and in NATO. Like this doesn't make any sense. Like why I don't believe that he somehow when he was being debriefed, he convinced himself that as the adjutant of a Feldmarschall that, oh, I'm not a Nazi, like I'm with you. I mean, I don't believe that happened just in the months after the day of defeat. I think he was compromised early on and thoroughly. But yeah, well, it's an important topic. But I hope people got something out of this, and I hope it met your expectations. I
Definitely,
very
I
much
hope the
enjoyed
people
doing it.
learned. I learned as I did. I learned some fascinating new stuff about kind of the inspiration, because you gotta understand, like, gifted leaders aren't just like given like talented abilities right away. They usually get them through hard experiences in life and
So
some of their
Rommel's
inspirations.
like I said, about the first book I read about the Third Reich was The Trail of the Fox, and my favorite German generals are Schorner von Richthofen, von Thoma, Sepp Dietrich. But I mean Rommel. Rommel was a hero. He was a great man. I mean, I anybody who's got any understanding of these things, kind of finds himself in awe of such a personage. But yeah, and I appreciate people tuning in, man. I I know I've been on hiatus a lot of this summer. When I get back from Ameren, I'm gonna try and stream some from Ameren, like I was saying before we went live. But I promise we're getting back to our regular content schedule. Plus, I'm changing things around, but by later this month, I promise, like we'll be back in the saddle. Thanks for being patient. I needed this hiatus to kind of reconstitute my spiritual and physical strength, but also I just needed to take a step back and think about the best way to proceed with what we're doing. Um, but yeah, so I just wanted to convey that. And yeah, let me know when you want to reconvene and do this, man. Again, maybe next Thursday if that's agreeable, but you just let me know. Does that sound good?
Yeah, definitely, that sounds good, man. We have an interesting question in the chat from Mr. MGM. He asks Mr. Thomas, "What are your thoughts on Patton's beliefs and tactics?"
I mean, Patton was he was one of the cavalry officers who was able to adapt to fighting in armor. So I mean, he had a certain intellectual plasticity that lent itself to warfighting. Um, I think comparatively, he was one of the better American officers. I'm a big fan of Matthew Ridgway on the American side. Um, I think for the U.S. Army of that epoch, I think Blackjack Pershing, frankly, like outshines any of the World War II generals. Um, but Patton, I can't, uh, I can't really say anything bad about him. I mean, other than he fought on the wrong side of the war. But I mean, that wasn't up to him. But yeah, he's. I don't think his reputation is outsized. And plus, like I said, like we'll get into this in subsequent episodes, but the U.S. Army didn't just lose when it met the Wehrmacht; like it got like cut to pieces. You know, like Patton turned that around. Okay, and I mean that speaks for itself. Okay, so he's a complex guy. I mean, yeah, his like legend is outsized, but it's not. But I mean, it's warranted in many respects. That's
Yeah,
my
he's
view
not
on
one
him.
of these anthropomorphized like American generals like MacArthur, who's kind
MacArthur
of
was a weird
overrated.
guy, and I think MacArthur also was not. Yeah, he was not admirable. I don't think, and there was something. He was a glory hound, and his Medal of Honor was I think very contrived, frankly. Um, you know, it's he was a strange man for the role he was afforded, but at the same time, it's not an accident. You know, he never would have gotten Eisenhower's job, and I mean, he was subordinate to the reason like the U.S. Army in the Pacific was in command at the command level. They were second fiddle of the Navy, man, absolutely. Okay, and there's a reason for that. Um, aside from MacArthur's ego and his tendency to offend civilian leadership. He was not a man who you wanted in a theater-wide command role. But yeah, I Patton's a compelling figure, definitely.
Yeah, there's at least something of substance to him, unlike these kind of more overrated, kind of like who didn't really achieve anything, besides just say attack, 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 basically, right? You know.
Yeah,
But with
yeah,
that being said, gentlemen, Mr. Thomas does have things there to do, so I really appreciate you all joining me, and I really appreciate conversation, and hopefully we can reconvene next Thursday to continue on the series. If you
yeah.
did
I
enjoy
leave
it,
on the
uh,
11th, which is Friday. So yeah, as long as we do it around this time, and then yeah. Let's tentatively plan for next Thursday, and then I'll be gone like Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I'll be back like Monday. But yeah. Let's plan on that.
yeah, like and sub as anons as well. I really appreciate it, and have a good rest of your evening. Remember, everyone, with Thomas on our side, we're gonna win.